When my daughter married into money, she changed her last name, her accent, and eventually me. She put me in a retirement home with peeling paint and called it downsizing. So I befriended her maid, rewrote my will, and watched from my plastic chair as my granddaughter inherited everything, and my daughter got nothing but a letter. What it said shocked everyone. My name is Marion, and I used to teach English to kids who hated books. They didn't hate stories. They just didn't know yet that pain could be useful if you learn to shape it. I spent 30 years showing teenagers how to find meaning in the mess. But nothing prepared me for the quiet cruelty of my own daughter looking me in the eye and calling it downsizing when she threw me away. The last time I stood in Ruth's house, it smelled like money. That scent, the mix of lavender polish, burnt espresso, and something expensive and cold, lingered on her marble countertops like it belonged more than I did. She wore a black silk blouse I'd never seen before, her hair in a tight twist like the women she used to mock on television. I asked if her husband would be joining us for dinner, and she smiled that hollow camera-ready smile. "Edward's in Brussels," she said. "He's closing a deal." She used to call him Eddie. She used to call me Mom. Now it was always Mother, like I was a department store account she hadn't closed yet. Let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Sam Barnes from Chicago. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. She'd hired a private chef for that dinner. We were eating sea bass with some kind of foam on the side, and all I could think about was the way she used to beg me for grilled cheese after ballet practice. Back then, she'd talk with her mouth full and hug me with greasy fingers. Now, every word out of her mouth sounded like it had been translated from another language. "You've accumulated quite a bit of stuff," she said between bites, tilting her wine glass like a judge. "We should start thinking about where you really want to be. Something manageable. Minimalist. It's a kindness, really." I nodded. I always nodded when I didn't want to cry. She was halfway through her second glass when she dropped the bomb. "A retirement residence. Near the lake. Lovely community, lots of sunlight," she said, like she was describing a spa brochure. I asked if I'd still be able to bring my books, and she looked startled. "Well, I suppose if they fit." Fit. Like I was luggage now. That night she handed me a gift-wrap box with a cream ribbon, inside a pair of gloves. Leather. Black. Beautiful. Too tight. I told her I loved them. I moved out 2 weeks later. The place wasn't near any lake, unless you counted the puddle that formed behind the dumpster after it rained. The paint peeled in the hallways like dead skin. They called it a facility, but it felt more like a waiting room for being forgotten. My room had a single window with bars, and the radiator knocked at night like it was trying to escape. Ruth visited once that first month, brought herbal tea and asked if I needed anything. I told her I missed my kettle. She smiled and said they probably didn't allow appliances. "But they have group yoga," she added, as if that could bend my grief into gratitude. Winter came early that year. The wind slipped through the cracks in the wall, and the heating went out in December. I wore Ruth's gloves to sleep, and they cut into my wrists like a warning. The nurse on night duty leaned in one evening and said, "They haven't paid this month. Just letting you know." I didn't say anything. I didn't ask who they were. I already knew. Ruth had moved on. I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a liability with a pension, a line item she was trying to close out before the new fiscal year. I sat in the common room in a plastic chair every morning after that. Same chair. Same corner. It squeaked when I moved, so I tried not to move much. I stopped joining the book club. I stopped asking if Ruth was coming. The other residents started calling me the reader, because I always had something in my lap, even if I wasn't turning the pages. What they didn't know was that I was watching. Every visitor. Every phone call. Every staff member. I was learning the texture of abandonment. I was studying what it looked like when someone pretended their past was a burden. I was taking notes. One night I heard laughter from the hallway. Real laughter, not the brittle kind people force. It came from the kitchen. I followed it quietly and saw Anna, the maid Ruth had once scolded for oversteeping tea, washing dishes with her daughter perched on a stool beside her, swinging her legs. Amelia, she said her name was. 11 years old, eyes too big for her face, curious. I brought them both cocoa the next night. We didn't speak much at first, but Anna always smiled with her eyes, and Amelia liked to guess the endings of my books before I told them. That's how it began. I still kept Ruth's gloves in my drawer. I never wore them again. They were there to remind me what didn't fit. What never did. What wasn't supposed to. I didn't call Ruth anymore. I stopped pretending I didn't notice when her text slowed, then disappeared. No more links to articles about active aging. No passive-aggressive reminders to drink my green tea. I vanished from her life like a photo she deleted but still remembered. I stopped mentioning her name around the staff, and when the mail came, I no longer checked for her handwriting. The withdrawal was slow, deliberate. I wasn't sulking. I was learning how to unhook myself from someone who only looked at me as a mirror to polish or turn away. If I wanted peace, I had to become quiet in her world. I had to become forgettable. And it worked. By the spring thaw, she'd stopped sending anything at all. Not a call, not a card, not even the annual Mother's Day orchid her assistant used to order. The silence didn't hurt the way you'd expect. It didn't burn. It froze. A slow, numbing cold that made me see how long I'd been shivering under her idea of love. Anna came every Wednesday to clean the hallways. Most staff passed through us like ghosts, efficient, silent, unseen. But Anna moved like someone who noticed things. She noticed the way I always folded my gloves before tucking them in the drawer. The way I pressed my fingers against the window, every morning like I was checking the temperature of my own hope. She never pushed conversation. That made me trust her. Amelia would sometimes come with her, school holidays, or days when she couldn't afford a sitter. The girl had eyes like searchlights, and a voice too gentle for this century. I watched her draw butterflies on the back of napkins while Anna scrubbed sinks. I didn't ask questions. I just began leaving out tea for them. One morning, Anna nodded toward the gloves and said, "Those don't look worn." I smiled and replied, "They were never meant to be." That's when she understood I wasn't just someone's mother. I was someone who'd been discarded with ceremony. By the second month of our quiet ritual, I began journaling again. I hadn't written since before Ruth married Edward. She'd told me once, mockingly, that diaries were for people who thought their thoughts were worth archiving. But Anna noticed the notebook on my lap one day and didn't ask what I was writing. She just said, "Sometimes the only proof we existed is in ink." I wrote about the feel of the air when Ruth stopped hugging me. I wrote about the birthday she skipped when Amelia was born. I wrote about the day she asked if I'd consider selling my house to free up some liquidity. I wrote down every little freeze that led to the frostbite. Not for revenge. Not yet. Just for clarity. Because memory can be a traitor, and I needed to keep mine honest if I was going to survive her absence without apologizing for breathing. Amelia began sitting beside me after dinner. We'd play simple word games, and I'd slip in vocabulary without her noticing. She caught on quickly. One evening, she asked why I always kept the same picture on my shelf. Me and Ruth on her graduation day, both of us younger, clinging to the fiction that we were still close. I told her it reminded me of who I used to be, and who Ruth used to pretend to love. Amelia said she didn't understand grown-ups and their pictures. I told her, "That's because you still remember how to feel without proof." She looked at me then like she'd caught something important. That's when I knew, this girl wasn't just kind. She was observant, sharp, and most dangerously of all, she was still warm in a world that rewarded cold. That's also when Anna started opening up. She didn't do it dramatically. There was no grand confession, no teary breakdown. Came in sideways phrases. Offhand remarks about Ruth's home. About how she wasn't allowed to use the front door. About how Ruth once scolded Amelia for eating a cookie on the white sofa. She said crumbs have class, Anna murmured one day, folding laundry. As long as they come from the right bakery. I didn't flinch. I just let the words settle into the same corner of my mind where I stored Ruth's comments about old people's smell and dignity and minimalism. That was when I knew I wasn't the only one she treated like excess. By the time summer arrived, I had stopped flinching when someone said my daughter's name. It no longer hurt because I no longer chased the illusion that I still belonged to her. I began investing in Amelia, not just emotionally but literally. I had savings Ruth didn't know about, old teachers' pensions, modest bonds. I made a note to revisit my will. Quietly. Strategically.
No hanno un cement.
Just motion in the dark, the way Ruth had moved through me until I disappeared. Only this time I was the one vanishing on purpose, and the outcome wouldn't be silence, it would be redirection. A rerouting of legacy, of love, of everything Ruth believed was hers by blood alone. The gloves stayed in the drawer. Every now and then I'd open it just to look at them. They still smelled like the perfume Ruth had worn that dinner. The one she claimed was French but was actually a knockoff. The scent had faded but not completely. I didn't toss them. Not yet. They were evidence. Not of warmth but of calculation. Of performance. Of how even a gift could become a weapon if you squeezed hard enough. They reminded me what I was no longer afraid to become. Someone cold enough to watch, to wait, and to reappear only when it mattered most. The first time I considered changing my will, I hesitated, not because I was unsure, but because I was still trained to feel guilty when I made decisions Ruth wouldn't like. That was the trap, wasn't it? Even in her absence, she had her fingers around my throat. She'd trained me to flinch in advance of her disappointment. But that guilt, I realized, wasn't love. It was residue. And I was done mistaking the lingering burn of her neglect for warmth. So I opened my old file cabinet, pulled out the manila folder marked estate, and for the first time in over a decade, I began subtracting my daughter from the future. I didn't do it dramatically. I didn't call Anna into the room and tell her what I planned. There was no righteous speech. Just a slow unraveling of ties that had been rotting for years. I reread the original will. Everything to Ruth. The house I no longer had. The books I'd packed into storage. Even the porcelain tea set she'd once mocked for being kitschy. I remembered how she'd laughed. I'll probably donate it all to a theater department someday. Like my life was a prop closet. I took a pen and drew a line through her name. The ink bled a little. I left it that way. I contacted Peter Lennox, one of my old students. He'd been a shy, nervous boy when I taught him sophomore English, always hiding behind his notebook, drawing comics in the margins. Now he was an estate attorney. He returned my call within 20 minutes. Said he remembered my class. Said I once told him that writing gave grief a shape. I told him I had some grief I needed shaped legally. He didn't ask many questions, just sent over the forms. I began filling them out late at night, with Anna quietly watching Amelia sketch giraffes on a napkin across the room. When I signed the beneficiary section, I paused. Then I wrote Amelia's name in clean, firm handwriting. It wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about correction. Ruth had spent years pretending I didn't exist, except when my existence served her narrative. I was the humble beginning in her origin story, the quaint backdrop she could polish out of photos but still summon when she needed to look grounded. My mother was a teacher, she'd tell society women while sipping something imported. She never said. My mother cried in a retirement home while I redecorated my third guest bathroom. I wasn't rewriting my will to hurt her. I was doing it because I finally understood that inheritance isn't about blood. It's about belief. And Amelia believed in me when I had nothing left to offer but stories. I began teaching Amelia more intentionally. Poetry at first. Then chess. Then the small things, how to listen for what people don't say, how to tell when someone's performing instead of speaking. We read Plath, then Angelou, then Audre Lorde. She asked what it meant when Lorde said, "Your silence will not protect you." I told her it meant we should never let politeness keep us from defending ourselves. She nodded, serious. That girl had more awareness at 11 than Ruth had at 38. When I told Anna I'd changed the will, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she whispered, "I don't know what to say." I said, "Say thank you. Then promise you'll help her not forget who she is." Peter filed the new documents. I made a point to lock them in my bedside drawer, behind the old photo of Ruth I still kept, not out of sentimentality, but as a study in before and after. The girl in that photo had braces, and braces had never made her ashamed to smile. Her curls hadn't been flat-ironed into submission. She still looked like someone I knew. Maybe that's why I hadn't thrown the picture away. Not because I missed her, but because part of me wanted to remember how complete the erasure had been. Ruth hadn't just outgrown me. She'd repainted her entire origin story. And I'd let her. Until now. Anna and I began to talk late into the evenings. She told me about her life before the maid uniforms, before she learned to walk without making noise. She'd been a medical student back home. Left after a man she trusted turned violent. She said Ruth treated her like she was invisible unless someone else was watching, In which case she'd overcompensate with fake kindness and louder cruelty later. She gave me a book once, Anna said, but made sure to tell me she didn't actually read it. Just thought it would look nice on a shelf. I asked which book. It was Pride and Prejudice. I laughed. Of course it was. Ruth would gift Elizabeth Bennet without reading The Spine. One night, Amelia looked at the gloves sitting in the drawer and asked why I never wore them. I told her they were too tight. She said, "You could stretch them out." I smiled and said, "Some things aren't meant to fit, and forcing them only ruins both sides." She didn't fully understand, not yet, but I hoped one day she would. That's the difference between raising a daughter and being one. Raising one means planting the truth and hoping they water it, even if you're not around to see the bloom. That summer, Ruth appeared on the cover of a business magazine with the headline, "Elegance in the Empire. The Women Behind the Men." She didn't mention me in the interview, but I saw the photo, her in pearls, holding a flute of champagne, that unnatural accent stitched into her vowels. I clipped it, folded it neatly, and tucked it inside the same envelope that now held my will. Not out of spite, but for symmetry. One day she'd be handed both. Her portrait and my decision. One picture for her story. One signature for mine. She knocked like she owned the hallway. 3 sharp taps, like punctuation. I recognized the rhythm before the door even opened. It was the sound of someone used to being obeyed. Ruth stood there in a trench coat too thin for winter, and sunglasses too large for sincerity. Behind her, the retirement home's flickering hallway light cast her in uneven shadow. She looked expensive and exhausted, the way a vase might look just before it cracks. I hadn't seen her in over a year, and in that time she'd aged in all the wrong places, corners of her mouth tugged down, worry stitched into her forehead. But her voice was still composed. "Mother," she said, not asking permission to enter, just expecting it. I let her in. I always had. That was the problem. I poured tea while she removed her coat like she was stepping onto a stage. "Edward's facing some legal turbulence," she offered, setting her oversized bag on the table like a claim. "Nothing serious. Just some regulatory drama. But things are in flux. We may be relocating temporarily. Geneva, perhaps." Her voice had that slippery sheen, like an actress forgetting her lines halfway through a monologue, but refusing to break character. I stirred sugar into my cup but said nothing. I was curious how long she could speak without asking how I'd been. 7 minutes, it turned out. Eventually, she looked around and said, "You've made it cozy." I glanced at the peeling wallpaper and stained radiator and smiled politely. "Luxury," I said. "All the amenities." She either didn't hear the sarcasm or chose to pretend she didn't. Ruth never liked being confronted with discomfort. She treated reality the way she treated accents, something to be edited out in post. "I've been thinking," she continued, brushing non-existent lint from her lap, "about family, legacy, about reconnecting. It's time we spent more time together. Really." She reached into her bag and pulled out a gift-wrapped box. Just a little something. I opened it slowly. A Chanel scarf, cream and black, soft as regret. It smelled faintly of her perfume, the same scent that had once clung to the gloves. I set it down carefully like a fragile lie. She smiled and asked if I remembered the gloves. "They suited you," she said. "Elegant, understated." I looked at her and replied, "They never fit." She blinked, confused. I didn't elaborate. I wanted her to sit with that silence, to taste what it felt like to miss something that wasn't ever truly hers. She'd returned expecting to find the version of me that still wanted to be loved by her. Instead, she found the woman she left behind, reassembled and cold as glass. Anna watched us from the kitchenette, drying mugs with precise quiet. I caught her eyes once, just once, and it grounded me. She didn't need to say anything. She already knew what this visit was. Ruth didn't come to offer warmth. She came because something in her world had gone cold, and now she was looking for insulation. Family was convenient again. I asked about Amelia. Ruth said who? I said, "Anna's daughter." She shrugged. "Oh yes, the little one. Quiet girl. Likes crayons, right?" She didn't notice the way Anna's spine straightened when she said it. That was the moment I knew Ruth hadn't changed. She'd just become more careful in her cruelty. More selective in when she showed her teeth. Later that night, after Ruth left with a forced hug and a cloud of designer desperation, I sat alone in the room and unfolded the scarf again. It was soft, yes, but hollow, like it was trying to be something more than it was. I placed it in the drawer with the gloves. The drawer was becoming a reliquary of failed gestures. Gifts given not out of love but obligation. Tokens meant to distract me from noticing I'd been left behind. But I noticed. I always noticed. The difference now was I no longer pretended not to. I got sick a week after that. The kind of sick that settles in your bones first, then radiates outward like a memory you can't shake. Anna brought warm broth and silence. Emilia read aloud from the poetry collection I'd given her. My hands trembled too much to hold a pen, so Anna wrote my final notes at my dictation. "Don't forget the envelope," I whispered. She nodded. "It's all ready. The lawyer has everything." I asked her to keep the gloves. She hesitated, then took them gently, folding them with reverence and understanding. "What should I tell her?" she asked softly. I said, "Tell her I learned from her, and that I finally used the lesson." Emilia kissed my cheek that night, and said she hoped I'd get better. I smiled and told her some things do get better, but not all of them come back. She asked if I was afraid. I told her no. I'd already lost the one thing that ever terrified me. My place in someone's heart. And I'd survived it. Now all that was left was to ensure that loss didn't echo into the next generation. That was the real inheritance. Not the money, not the house, but the decision to end the lineage of quiet erasure. Outside, the snow began again. Soft and steady. The kind of snow that doesn't announce itself, just changes everything while you're looking somewhere else. I lay back in the bed and closed my eyes. Ruth had come back looking for something to salvage. What she didn't understand was that I'd already burned what was left between us. Quietly, neatly, with the same cold precision she once used on me. I died in my sleep. Quietly, the nurse said,
"No struggle."
Just a deep breath and then stillness. That's how Anna described it later. She said it looked like I'd remembered something good and held on to it. Maybe I had. Maybe it was Emilia's voice reading me that last poem. Or maybe it was just the knowledge that everything was finally in place, that the damage Ruth left behind had been contained, quarantined from the next generation. I didn't leave with peace exactly. I left with clarity. And clarity is heavier, but it's honest. It was enough. They held the will reading 2 weeks after the funeral. Ruth chose the location. A private conference room in one of those glass towers downtown with minimalist furniture and scented hand towels in the bathroom. She wore black like armor, her makeup impeccable, her grief rehearsed. She sat with perfect posture, legs crossed at the ankle, eyes just glossy enough to seem human. Peter, the lawyer, greeted her gently but not warmly. He'd only met her once before, and even then she'd referred to him as the paperwork man. That day she called him Peter like she owned the syllables. Anna and Emilia sat near the back. Emilia wore a navy dress and clutched a small book in her lap. The collected poems of Louise Gluck. My copy. I left her a note on the inside cover. For the days when the truth feels too heavy to carry out loud. She hadn't cried at the funeral, but that morning, Anna told me she'd stood by the window at dawn and whispered, "I won't let her forget you." I believed her. Emilia understood legacy in a way Ruth never had. Ruth thought legacy was what you left in a vault. Emilia knew it was what you leave behind in a child's hands. Peter began by reading the standard legal preamble. Ruth looked bored. She expected what she'd always expected, everything. Even if we drifted. Even if she'd lost touch. She believed that blood outweighed behavior, that titles outlasted truth. But titles can be revoked. And blood, I'd come to learn, stains both ways. So when Peter cleared his throat and said, as per the final revised testament of Marion Halloway, dated August 3rd of last year. And Ruth's head tilted. I imagined her sensing it, like a ripple in the air before thunder. The room changed when my letter was opened. It was printed on ivory paper, folded precisely. My handwriting was legible but firm. Peter read it aloud, just as I requested. To my daughter Ruth, you taught me how to be cold. Not through violence, not through absence, but through something quieter and harder to name. You taught me through transactions disguised as affection. Through visits measured in gifts. Through love laced with optics and shame. I watched you rewrite your past, strip me from your sentences, repurpose my sacrifices into anecdotes for rooms I'd never be invited to. I waited for apologies that never arrived, and birthdays that slipped past like they were beneath acknowledgement. And then I stopped waiting. I stopped trying to wear what didn't fit. I gave what remained of me to someone who reminded me that warmth is still possible. Even if it skips a generation, Amelia receives everything. The accounts, the copyrights, the remaining assets, the journals, the name. You received this letter, Ruth. Not because I want to hurt you, but because I want you to finally understand the shape of what you left behind. Love isn't something you inherit by default. It's something you prove worthy of by presence, by kindness, by return. I left. And I left it all to someone who stayed. The silence that followed was brutal. Ruth didn't speak. Her breath caught once, but not in grief, in calculation. I knew that sound. I'd heard it 100 times before. The moment she realized the game had shifted without her input. She sat very still, blinking slowly, then said, "This is a mistake. There's been some confusion." Peter calmly slid the signed documents across the table. "Everything's been verified, witnessed, certified. There is no confusion." She picked up the pages like they were foreign currency, her hands trembling just enough to show the crack forming beneath her composure. She turned to Anna. "Did you encourage this?" Her voice was ice. Anna didn't flinch. She simply replied, "I honored her wishes." Ruth scoffed and stood too quickly. Her chair scraped the floor with a noise that made Amelia wince. "This is absurd," Ruth muttered. "That child isn't even family." Amelia finally looked up and said quietly, "She was mine." Ruth froze. She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't want to know. Afterward, Ruth tried to contest the will. Of course she did. She hired men with sharp suits and empty eyes. But everything was airtight. Peter had seen to that. Every asset had been reallocated with surgical precision. By the time her lawyers filed the paperwork, the accounts had already been transferred, the home redeeded. All that remained for Ruth were memories she never made and a legacy she no longer owned. The press caught wind eventually. Socialite disinherited by estranged mother. Everything left to housekeeper's child. She called it slander. But they printed the photo of her walking out of the courthouse anyway. Eyes hidden, mouth tight, dignity leaking through her heels. As for Amelia, she didn't buy a car or throw a party. She didn't post about the inheritance. She renovated the retirement home instead. New beds, working heaters, painted walls that didn't peel. She set up a small library in my name, filled it with poetry and blankets and quiet corners for daughters who needed to feel safe. On the wall, framed in glass, were the gloves. Beside them, a plaque that read, "For when you think you've outgrown someone." That was the confrontation Ruth never saw coming. Not the legal one, not even the financial one, but the moral reckoning. The slow realization that the mother she'd discarded didn't just leave. She chose. She curated her final act. And she gave her warmth to someone who wouldn't turn it into branding. Someone who knew the difference between inheritance and extraction. Someone who didn't need to share my blood to carry my name forward. If you're listening to this, it means I'm already gone. But part of me always knew the final chapter would be written without me. Not in grief, not in spectacle, but in continuation. That's what we forget sometimes. That closure isn't the end of a thing. It's the beginning of it no longer hurting. I don't know where Ruth is now. Maybe still clinging to the last remnants of her image, trying to rebrand her erasure into something noble. I imagine her somewhere glossy, talking to people who don't really care, rehearsing versions of a childhood that never quite existed. But I don't think about her much anymore. The edges have softened. The urgency is gone. That's the gift revenge doesn't tell you about. If you do it right, you never have to speak their name again. The home looks different now. The hallway that once smelled of bleach and resignation now holds warmth in its paint. Anna hired a small team, people who'd been overlooked, undervalued. She called them quiet rebuilders. The beds were replaced with ones that didn't creak. The radiators now hum instead of bang. The peeling ceiling tiles were redone, not just patched. There's a sign on the front door that says, "No one disappears here." Amelia designed it herself. She also added the chess table to the library. The same one we used to play on every Wednesday, with mismatched pieces and a tea kettle humming beside us. Only now the set is complete. Ivory and obsidian. And on the center shelf sits a velvet box containing the queen. I left her that piece with a note. You always saw the whole board even when others thought you were just a pawn. It wasn't metaphor. Amelia had a way of reading people, of sensing when something unspoken was happening in the room. She'd known, even before Anna told her, that Ruth wasn't coming back. She'd known when to lean in, when to speak less. She never asked for anything, never postured. That's why she received everything. Not because she demanded it, but because she was the only one who never asked for more than what I had to give. People came, quietly at first, then more frequently. Daughters, granddaughters, women in their 50s who'd been estranged from their mothers and didn't know where to put the ache. Widows, teachers, teenagers who hated poetry until Amelia made them read one aloud in that little library. It became a refuge, not just a room. A place to sit with someone else's words until your own became less sharp. On the wall, beneath the gloves, Amelia added one more thing. A photograph of me and her. We're seated on the library floor, books scattered, her head resting against my shoulder. I didn't know she'd taken it, but she framed it next to the quote. Some things die in winter, yes, but not everything that dies stays buried. As for Ruth, she stayed gone. She didn't come to contest the final trust dispersal. Didn't send a letter. Not even a lawyer this time. There were whispers in the tabloids, rumors about a divorce, a failed fund, a lawsuit in Monaco. One article called her a cautionary figure. Another said she'd started a podcast about reinvention. She titled it Grace After Ashes. I didn't listen to a second of it. Not because I was angry. Because I was free. Because nothing she could say now had the weight to interrupt my silence. The only sound I wanted was Amelia's voice reading one more poem to the women seated in the library on a Thursday afternoon. Closure didn't come with a slam. No doors were slammed. No grand confrontations.
No screaming.
That's what people don't understand about the end. It isn't loud. It's a letting go that feels like exhaling after holding your breath for years. It's walking past the drawer where the gloves used to be, and realizing you don't even think about them anymore. It's realizing that you've left behind not just the pain, but the habit of bending toward someone who never reached back. Closure is the moment you stop explaining your worth to people who need you to shrink for them to feel tall. Before I died, I recorded one final journal entry. Not for Ruth. Not even for Amelia, though I hope she hears it one day. It was for anyone who's ever wondered if walking away makes them cruel. Doesn't. Staying in a room where your name is only said when it's useful. That's what breaks you. Walking away is how you rebuild. Quietly. Piece by piece. Even if you have to leave behind people you once loved more than yourself. Amelia will be okay. I know that now. She's already begun writing her own stories. Some of them start where mine ended. Some don't mention me at all. That's good. That means I did my job. I told her once that being seen fully is the rarest kind of love. She asked me how I knew. I told her, because I went 60 years without it. And then you walked in with a library card and a smile too big for your face. She blushed and asked if that meant she saved me. I said no. It meant she reminded me that I was still here. Still worth saving. So if you're still listening, here's what I'll leave you with. Love out loud. Make your exits count. And if someone ever tries to convince you that your memory is inconvenient, rewrite the ending yourself. Sign it in ink. Leave it in a drawer. And give the queen to someone who knows how to use her. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe for more confessions that cut deep, betrayals that linger, and quiet revenge that reshapes everything. Because sometimes the most powerful endings aren't loud, they're deliberate. See you soon in the next story.